So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our conference on the city. Yes, thank you for being here. I'm very happy. Yesterday we had such a wonderful day. Today we have only half a day presentations and discussions, and then we will have a tour. I will say a few words about the tour after the second session before the lunch, actually. So now let us open this morning with the first panel. Who owns public spaces, urban exclusion, isolation, and strategies of placemaking? In a way, all the three speakers we have on this panel, Talia Blokland, the four speakers, because the second paper is written by two speakers, Limor Yoda and Michael Breyer. And the third one by Noga Kedar. They are all addressing the importance of urban space as a space of inclusion, a place that is accessible and used by different social groups. But they do it in a different way. The first two presentations, Talia's presentation and Limor's and Michael's presentation, point out where this ideal of inclusive public space does not work. Talia is going to talk about urban seclusion in Berlin, which results from the unwillingness of certain social groups to be in contact with other people that are unlike them. They have strategies evolve from the city life itself that allow them to avoid each other. So this separation results from people's lifestyle, from the choices they make in their own city. And Limor and Michal are going to talk about a very different kind of urban separation, the one resulting from urban politics of apartheid, or at least what they compare it to South African apartheid, which is most notably in Jerusalem. The building of the wall, which actually is a physical separation of two groups living in the city. We will hear about strategies of overcoming the separation. Talia mentions digitalization, and Limor and Michal suggest to learn from South African apartheid experience to create here also a more inclusive society. So, and Noga's talk connects to this by providing analytical tool to generally understand strategies of placemaking, how they evolve and how they circulate. So these insights may be widely applied, and also they can be used to better understand how to overcome both the problem of seclusion in Berlin and the segregation in Jerusalem. So thank you very much. Talia, the floor is yours.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to. Sorry, I forgot to tell everyone about you.
Oh, that's okay. You can do that after.
You don't.
You want to do it?
Yes, sure. Of course. Sorry. So, Talia Blokland is a professor in urban and regional sociology at Humboldt University in Berlin and director of the Georg Simmel Center for Urban Studies at the same university. Her work focuses on questions of interurban inequalities between people and places. She has published on urban community and cohesion on conceptual level, for example, in her Community as Urban Practice, and has published widely on urban poverty, urban violence and safety, urban middle classes, and gentrification. Her most recent publications address segregation in Berlin, the consequences of COVID-19 for urban life, and networks and neighborhood belongings, such as roots and roots in neighborhoods. And making sense of segregation in a well-connected city, the case of Berlin, urban socio-economic segregation and income inequality. Now the floor is yours. Sorry.
Now I have an identity. So hello again. Okay. A local newspaper reported recently that a man attacked a woman. That's right, on public transport, and pulled down her headscarf after having been verbally abusive. Its tweet headlined it as a crime and said that the state security, Staatsschutz, had been notified. That post was retweeted various times to thematize racism by some Twitter users, with Twitters like a comment like, retweeting it with a comment like racism in, and then the name of the neighborhood. It also received very different critical comments under the post. Quite a few people criticized that the state security got notified, as is a regular procedure in hate crime. The overtone of these comments was one of wonderment that this was called a crime at all, and that it was obvious where the state had its priorities nowadays. Nothing was done against real violence in the street, but the state security made all this fuss over a piece of cloth. Then I read the newspaper article itself. It revealed that the man had, according to the report, been unsuccessful trying to pull off the headscarf because other urban citizens had interfered. This had caught my attention for two reasons. First, as it showed that anti-racist framing of a fact in such a clear contrast to the framing that we may want to classify as right-wing, even though I'm sure that the people who commented on it wouldn't see themselves as right-wing, but as telling the truth, I find it important for my talk for today that none of the participants in this tweet, in the comments on the tweet, had been in presence. And this learning about the world was entirely digital, through the digital traces that other people left on Twitter before and after it was posted. So, secondly, I find it important for today, reading that newspaper article, that I learned other people prevented that their headscarf was pulled down. Streets are indispensable assets where the disempowered find new escapes and reclaim their rights to cities in different fashions, as F. Bayat says. While in the presence in this case, although we may all know cases where this was not the case, but in this case, people would have learned by experience, had they been there rather than on Twitter, that other people think racism is not okay, and that some people understand it as the right thing to do and the moral obligation to do something when racism happens. In the digital space, scrolling through one's feeds, people learned either that this neighborhood has racism and that hate crime happens there, or they learned from the comments that the state protects those people against the smallest possible acts, but not its proper citizens, suggesting connections between Muslim identity, crime, and a relaxed state approach. Had there been no digital media, and we'd all had read the paper, we may have started sharing similar opinions at the dinner table. Public availability of that conversation would have not been given. So Twitter hijacked the symbolic ownership of the city, understood as the social fabric of fluid encounters of people going about their daily routines, and while they do so, thrown together with other people, doing very moral things. So I follow the idea of morality by Abbott as morality as a relational practice, a diffuse and variable practice that is enacted in daily life. So civic morality, then, are the diffuse and variable things that people do that enhance democratic and human rights values in the practices of daily routines. The third point about it is that the acts took place in the city in a mobility moment that was temporal. It was not fixed in a place. It wasn't in a location, it wasn't in a building, and much of urban studies has separated people's passing through public from the rest of their lives. We pay attention to their homes, to their private settings, to their neighborhood organizations, and we pay little attention. And that's what we call real, right? That's what we in urban studies see as the object of what we do, is people's real activities. Where do you work? Where do your friends live? Where's your family? First comes the home, then comes the neighborhood, and then very little else. So this paper has 4 concerns, which is why it took me so much energy to cut it down, because 4 is way too much. That I derive from this example, and which I will summarize under the risks of seclusion that are directly enhanced. So I'm doing the opposite. I'm not arguing that digitalization helps cohesion. I'm saying that digitalization is part of the problem, or maybe is a large problem, directly enhanced by the technological possibilities of using digital devices. So seclusion is enabled by the possibility of doing digital life. Second, I discuss public space as the site where seclusion creates a selective presence of the disenfranchised and further fragmentation of urban citizenship. Thirdly, I discuss public space as the site of togetherness where the moral capacities to do these things that I was just mentioning are limited through the absence of certain residents. And fourthly, I discuss public space as the site where, because only some people intensively use it, state control and government of marginalized groups and communities can tighten themselves, become more tight, and be away from what I call the watchful eyes of the more powerful. And that is sort of where I take inspiration from some colleagues from Latin America. So there is a long paper sheet on the methods and the case, and this talk ended up being far less empirical than I had imagined. I was going to give you lots of quotes, and that is because I was very ambitious in thinking that I had loads of time to do this. So it draws on all these projects that we did under COVID-19, a bigger empirical project, which was both quantitative and qualitative. It draws on a project Mothers in the Metropolis, which are 138 interviews with middle class and lower class mothers in Berlin, talking about how they organize resources for their children. This was pre-COVID, and then a number of more smaller ethnographic projects and qualitative interviewing with social workers, police officers, and the social psychiatric services. So I start that paper from the notion of urban citizenship with the idea that that link we're going to say for the discussion, because the idea is that as the German citizenship is absent for many of the people in parts of our fieldwork, it makes sense to include that entitlement of roaming the street as is done in the theoretical discussion of urban citizenship, and use that as a lens to look at these practices of seclusion. So public space has, of course, been thought about in many ways, and I could spend 20 of the 20 minutes discussing that, but I wanted to note that what I mean by it is that when we entered our houses, or hotel rooms in this case, but this morning, that the moment you do that, that the life that we practice when we're on our ways to someplace else, on our ways in the public space to someplace else, and therefore weave an urban fabric with others, that is the kind of public space that I'm referring to. Fluid encounters, then, are brief interactions between people who are unknown to each other, but that continue to affect our lives. So I'm not talking about social relationships, I'm not talking about people's networks, I'm not talking about their strong and weak ties, but for anyone who is acquainted with Granovetter, I'm talking about his footnote where he talks about the absent ties, and put them in a footnote because he can't measure them in network tools. And in another paper, we've argued that over time, the network research that is involved with social capital and all that kind of concepts has almost completely starting to ignore these things because they're really difficult to measure in social network research. And there is a literature, of course, on encounters by Helen Wilson, Gil Valentine, and others that I relate to on a theoretical level, but I think that we can talk about in the break for those who are really into that kind of discussion. So fluid encounters, also in the Community as Urban Practice book, are defined as interactions between people at sites in the cities where they've never been before, where they meet people that have never met before, they may never meet again, they may have met them before and meet them again tomorrow, but they still engage in very brief moments of sociability. Now, why is that linked to urban citizenship? Well, in my head, the relevance of that lies in the idea that Asef Bayat, and the idea of the forms of what the street can do in terms of learning and in terms of getting things done together.
And just so to put that in perspective for those of you, the very few of you who do not know Berlin, I don't think there is anyone, so I can move on. But there is quite this is a graph that shows you the number of people who have no German, the diversity of people that have no German citizenship, which was 700, yeah, you can read it, 785,550 in 2019. So this is before the Ukraine situation. And I think it's relevant because voicing opinions without, because you could say, you know, Asaf Bayat is not really relevant. He writes about Iran, and you could maybe apply him to Israel, but you know, in Berlin, it's kind of the German political freedom of expression and protest is legally guaranteed. There are multiple ways of voicing opinions. You can do art, you can do all sorts of projects. You never have to fear any consequences. At the same time, political influence through voting is biased towards people with a German passport, as those without such passport are only eligible for local voting. So in the city of Berlin, with 24.3% of the officially registered residents, which is not the residents, it's the officially registered residents, do not have German citizenship, and 70% of those do not come from EU countries, which means they have no voting rights at all. Al-Qaed has shown in her study that people with Turkish migration histories who have voting rights are more likely to exercise political rights if they also participate in local ethnic organizations. And she's just documented for people who have particular rights in voting that these kind of infrastructures are relevant. For people without such rights, or even for people who are stateless, which is 2.8% of all the foreigners in Berlin, the vehicles of becoming political present must be found elsewhere. So for migrant women in one of the neighborhoods that we study, we find that what Abidar in her novel calls a louding voice, a way of making your voice loud, is severely constrained and was especially constrained during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, fluid encounters are also full of risks, and it's not that if you encounter other people in the street, you can learn all the time. It's always going to be positive, and it doesn't guarantee any socialization across differences. And it doesn't imply itself that good things will happen. It doesn't imply that at all. But the point is that without fluid encounters, social mix across categorical boundaries is unlikely to happen at all. And in that novel of Abidar, you see how it's a novel placed in Lagos in Nigeria, and the girl comes having socialized, learned by socialization, that there is certain gender conditions and that she has to live in a certain situation of exploitation. She's always feeling very angry about this and sensing has a deep sense that this is not what life should be. But not until she has a fluid encounter with a neighbor who happens to be visiting her boss. She works as a maid at some point and is being very exploited in this big house and very rich people. And not until she happens to serve food, which she wasn't supposed to do because it wasn't her task, but she ended up doing it anyway. Long story short, she encounters a woman that was raised in Britain who has a very different idea of gender relations, and then she starts learning. But the fluid encounter, the moment of accidental rubbing shoulders, had to happen first for those two to become related at all and to develop some sort of more intensive tie. So to be an urban citizen, if that's about voice and about being heard, then the hearing is done by the more powerful, and their idea of who you are and how you must be taken into account depends on the loudness of your voice and the sharpness of your visibility. And therefore, I think the work of Asaf Bayat can also be used in places like Berlin, and also there we can think about the street or the public space as the site for learning by experience. But then, of course, the question is, who gets thrown together? When it is this Doreen Massey thrown togetherness that we also think is important, then who is thrown together with whom and where? And that are two pictures of the community center where we did the interviews with the women and the experiences of being excluded and from all sorts of social experiences during COVID-19. But I want to move on to the part that talks about the seclusion. So moments of learning can be understood as in two ways, as learning by experience, and I contrast that with learning by socialization. Public space where strong togetherness includes all sorts of residents in the city. That means that you have encounters with people in different positions in all sorts of categorical characteristics. Now, the literature on conviviality and superdiversity has both expressed the ideal of such coexistence to produce all sorts of wonderful effects and criticized it. As long as public space exists and as long as people use it, these are sites of casual forms of learning by experience. And learning by socialization is that someone tells you what to do, and there's a punishment and reward if you do or not. It's how we think we raise our kids. Learning by experience is happening to be in a place where something happens that may be completely off with what you've learned by socialization, that is the proper, the right, the wrong, or the good, or the bad thing to do. So the casual form of learning by experience can be contrasted with learning by socialization. So think of that socialization as a project that is well intended and organized. You know, institutions around human beings do these things. Schools, community centers, social projects, art initiatives, families, and so on. However, the concept of learning by experience is in public space is being in presence with things that happen, that end up opening your horizon, but you didn't set out to learn at all. It happened while you were doing other things. Now, the digitalization of communication brings, as the example of the beginning of my paper suggests, a new dimension to this. Because it's very hard to learn by experience in that same way online as we do in everyday encounters in the realist world, because the way we all know this, the way that the feeds and the algorithms organize what we see is already geared to what they know we've looked at yesterday. So people will expect, and why that matters empirically is people that expect that others, we did a big survey on social safety in 4 different neighborhoods, and people that expect that others in public space will, for example, call the police if there's a burglary. They feel, and we have established this now in like Rotterdam and in 4 neighborhoods, and then in 4 neighborhoods in Berlin, and another neighborhood in Berlin. So it seems to be quite robust finding that people that expect others to intervene on their behalf have a higher sense of safety. So expectations of civic behavior and civility that people learn by experience, that predicts how they then assess the safety of the area, the safety of the city, and it's not their fear of crime or victimhood. And be interesting, we never did the data collection that way, but we should have asked people's social media use, because I think we could then correlate that the fear of victimhood of crime and all that kind of things would correlate with what people read on Twitter. So the digitalization of everyday life, home office, home delivery, digital meetings, reduce those experiences. I don't see that someone interfered when someone else tried to pull down the headscarf. I don't see that someone did not interfere when someone was beaten up at the bus stop. I don't make those kind of experiences because I'm sitting home doing my digital things. Well, some live digitally, of course. Well, some live digitally, of course. Others must deliver their stuff. So that brings up an entire theme of fragmentation that I can't go in here. But the fragmentation that achieves is that is less discussed, I think, there's less discussed in the literature, is that when research groups can opt out of public space in more and more ways, that is achieving a new dimension. That, well, of course, this is not new, right? Because in the Middle Ages, leaving one's house, everybody has to leave the house to meet someone. Just imagine. You always had to leave your house to communicate with someone outside of your household. So that produced, but then of course people did that in the elites did that in their horse-cooled carts with the curtains closed, right? So I don't want to romanticize the Middle Ages here. But first came the telephone, and then of course after that, the digital communication and consumption. This has completely changed the ways we do these things. So the more resources you have, the more you can opt out of any public space where you may rub shoulders with people who differ. And we tend to think like the picture that we saw yesterday in one of the presentations of the Sao Paulo. I think that picture is also in one of my books. So it's like the iconic picture of what that means. But I think it's important now with the recent movement in Berlin to doing a lot of things online to reflect on what it means on a sort of more mundane level, and it doesn't have to be so extreme to see that there's a similar social process going on. So the argument of seclusion in Berlin is that middle-class German citizens, also carriers of German passports, are, and this is an empirical hypothesis, more likely to practice lives away from fluid encounters than others. In Berlin, this is not only because they no longer live in Berlin, but in the surrounding regions, in all sorts of satellite towns that have boomed since the wall came down, and that we as urban scholars conveniently ignore. It's also because the suggestion from the interviews with middle-class mothers is that since the pandemic, the digitalization of services, the platform economy, and the digitalization of work and the introduction of home office may have made their lifestyles of what Atkinson called in 2006 already the padding the bunker, available to a much larger part of the population than it was in the early 2000s when it was a matter for the elite. So for Atkinson, it was an observed pattern among the elites, and one may argue that in some of Berlin's most well-known areas, this is not the case. There's a vibrant public life which middle-class residents participate, and indeed there is. But statistically speaking, this is a small number. This is a map of the voting behavior of Berlin in 2023, and you see that everything that's dark blue is CDU, and everything that's light blue is the right wing, which is like only there on the upper right side. And then this is all Berlin. This is not Berlin and its suburbs. This is the city of Berlin. And most of the scholarship that we see is about here. So that is Kreuzberg and that sort of. So that's where you go, right? When you're most of you stay in that green area. So my suggestion is that one may argue that in some of Berlin's most areas there is this, right? There is this sort of fluid life, but it's statistically speaking small, and it's not all that much encounter as it really seems. Take biking. I know. Biking is fantastic, right? Biking is the new thing. Biking takes you out of encounters of nearness of other bodies. If you bike, you don't ride the public transport. It's not that people move from cars to bikes. Car use is not going down. People move from public transport, especially since the pandemic, to their bikes. So biking, because it's so regulated, biking lanes, biking lights, there's very little negotiation of what you have to do when you're riding a bike compared to when you're riding packed public transport. So the extent that this part of the city is so exceptional in its multicultural encounters is yet to be seen. So the extent that their presence is still preserved, it is of course carrying a lot of positive aspects. They may amplify people's voices, as we have seen with the organization of housing rights in Berlin, the refugee rights in the center of Berlin. Some may do so because of a sense of justice and enough time of activism. In Berlin, and especially, of course, West Berlin has a very strong tradition in doing this. I don't want to sort of deny that or ignore that, but I see a risk that this relatively small enclave in this wider metropolitan region, and this is only the city, will not be enough, and that many other people increasingly digitalize their everyday routines. So here are two quotes from interviews with mothers that we did who commented after the pandemic or at the last end of the pandemic on how much they enjoyed the fact that they didn't have to go to PDA meetings anymore, and how much they liked this cocooning with their own family in their house. And from there, in another paper that solely focuses on these women, I argue that middle-class women tend to build bubbles of seclusion when they live in relatively mixed neighborhoods, and that middle-class women praise digitalization as a form of having quality time with their own family, but while doing this, in those routines and digitalizing the shopping basket that is actually also withdrawing them from public space. If I had 20,000 words in a paper or an hour to talk, I would speculate that there's also an element which you could do with the work of Mary Douglas on the moral purity and the idea that if you're in your own bubble, all these things that are so important to us, self-care, ecological awareness, Achtsamkeit in German, that all of that is easier if you shield yourself off to the aggression and the violence that's around you. And that the pandemic's digitalization of routine activities has enabled that, but this, and this is a point I do want to say something about, but I have forgotten to put my watch, so I have no idea how I am on time. That wasting time and staying in line is something that we also lose, and that's really important. But I think I'm out of time. So, and that part of the paper is going to in a direction where I say, okay, so if this is the case, let me just summarize that really briefly. If this is the case that people are secluding, right? If they're taking them out of public space, so what? So my hypothesis there is that this thrown togetherness loses some of its moral capacities, not because the people are not moral anymore, but that the capacity of doing moral behavior with people that are diverse are reduced, and that there's also an increasing possibility for the state to do things to those who use the public space that are unseen. And maybe I best illustrate that with this last slide, namely, I don't know if you've seen this film, I, Daniel Blake, but if you haven't, you have to see it. I've seen it like 7 times, and I still have to cry. Daniel Blake is a relatively resourced man that is a working class man in Britain who has to go to the unemployment office and social services. And it's a true mess. The point that I want to highlight of that is not so much what happens to him, but at some point the woman that you see on the flyer is also at that office. And she's having a fight with the street level worker in that place. And he's in the waiting area. And he notices that she's being unfairly treated. And he interferes. And then something develops out of that, and they start supporting each other and all of that. I'm fascinated by this moment because the precondition of that was waiting in one particular space. But if half of us does everything digital and online, and the other half, through the new COVID measurements, is being told that no waiting room anymore, and that all we do is appointments, either by email, by phone. You cannot, the labor office in Berlin, till today, has changed the system in which they work. You used to just show up and stand in line. Then during COVID, they started these routines. But these routines do not bounce back. And the argument of that is it's more efficient, it's digital, it's easier accessible. Berlin's Verwaltung is finally becoming digital. I see something else. You are out of the watchful eyes of others if you communicate with your urban residents who are not citizens, who don't necessarily know their rights, in the invisibility of everybody else. So even if you have these waiting lines, you know how certain offices have this strip on the floor and it says private, you stay behind the line, respect people's privacy. The more I think about this, the more I wonder, whose privacy am I really protecting? Is this attempt to shield our private information something that people really need, or is it also something that normalizes that state agents can talk to their residents without other people to interfere? I have a similar example with stuff that we did with the police, and how you can see that policing in public space can be thought of in a similar direction, but I'm running way out of time, so I'm going to skip that. Concluding remarks then is that we from urban life under COVID-19 data and monitoring the metropolis may conclude that there are some patterns of seclusion that create a loss of an urban fabric, the loss of an urban fabric, especially for people that are already unequally sorted in the city of on a socioeconomic level. It does not restrict Berliners in one way, it restricts, but it restricts the loudening of voices of politically disenfranchised people as their casual learning by experience is severed and interactions with state agents are withdrawn from watchful eyes. Therefore, digitalization should be thought of as a technological bluff. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Very interesting. It was a little bit different from the abstract, though. I had a question, but now I have another question. I will ask, then we will collect some. Is it okay? And then we will let you answer. I think it's very illuminating what you said about fluid encounters. Things that I did not think about. I would suggest taking it maybe one step further, because you said that about something about interfering. That if you have never been to a neighborhood, you would not know, or you only rarely, you would not know if people really interfere if something happens. So you cannot, you make an assumption that they won't, for example, and therefore you will not feel secure in this neighborhood. But I think that we rather rarely see people interfere. Right? And also if we see it, this is one person who did it, and next time something happened, this person might not be there. So I think it would be interesting to see why people would assume that people interfere or not. My guess is that it is not based on the experience having seen someone interfering. But it's a wild guess, but my guess would be that it is just based on being familiar with somebody through these fluid encounters. And I know some related research about how we change our opinions about people if we have something to identify them. For example, we have seen their face, or we know their name. And there is research that even if a person is given a number, just a number, then we already would be in favor of this person in case of a conflict or something like that. So another line of research, but I think it connects to what you are writing. So I think these fluid encounters make this, I think it is called identifiability for us. So it is not just someone, but it is more personal for us, and therefore it builds trust, although it doesn't have a special basis. Just because I have seen this person, I trust him or her more. Mm-hmm. Okay, please, Noga. Yes, microphone.
Thanks, Talia. It was really thought-provoking and important. I have two questions about, I guess, future direction of this intellectual pursuit. One is, I think that the goal of one of the main tasks of urban sociologists and urbanists in general is to understand the mechanism that creates segregation and seclusion. And I was wondering, what do you think it is in the digital age? I think that you left it, you said something general about algorithms, but I was wondering whether you have additional direction to investigate that. And the other question is about cases that the digital space and the physical space actually can support or enhance one another in creating these moral capacities.
Thank you. That's, I mean, I've got so many things to say, and that would take up all morning, so I try to focus on a few points. And one thing was, you mentioned that a lot of people in Berlin don't have German passports. And yesterday got me thinking about belonging as a legal concept. And I think a lot of things have been done wrong in Germany when people have been, well, kind of started with the concept of Gastarbeiter, guest workers, putting people into their place, telling them you're guests, but you don't belong here. And at the same time, complaining about people not wanting to integrate. What you need to decide, either you belong here or you don't. And if you don't, how do you expect anybody to behave in a way like they do? So belonging as a legal concept is such a good idea. I've been thinking about the importance of belonging for a long time, but yesterday my eyes were kind of opened in that regard. Well, Then online communication, I guess it's another case of the medium as a message, and online the message is often poisoned. I read a lot of Die Welt, a very conservative German newspaper, just to look at the comment section and see how people take every opportunity to make racist remarks. And that, again, fascinates me. I mean, they could be talking about the weather, and somebody will blame the foreigners. And last thing, I, Daniel Blake, such a good movie. I remember how politicians were talking about, oh, that's just a movie. And then people were speaking out and saying, oh, no, my life was actually worse. Somebody I photographed told me, that used to be my life until I turned homeless. And so many people can relate to that. And the beauty of Ken Loach's work is showing that poverty doesn't mean you're devoid of morality. And he also shows that poor people deserve dignity. And I could go on all morning, so who else?
Avnel, right? Oh, no, Ishai. And I also saw another hand. Okay.
So thank you, Talia. It was brilliant. And I think maybe it's continuing some of what Tim was saying, which if we do indeed, and I take your claim seriously, learn from these experiences, then I'm sure there are many, many terrible experiences that we also learn through urban socialization. I mean, that is the not socialization, through the experience, that actually are better off if we don't experience them. So many racist interactions, turning a blind eye. So, you know, there would be one Daniel Blake, but many others who simply kind of look the other way. And perhaps then how it would complicate in other ways the things that we stop learning, in a sense, the more or the less we have these kinds of experiences. Or perhaps if we think maybe what's next, then can we, you know, assuming that we can get rid of Twitter or of the various digital platforms, what can be learned from the digital platforms? You know, so it's not just scrolling, perhaps actually people learn that there is also a form of intervention there, a form of turning a blind eye on Twitter, and on the other hand, the bad experiences that maybe, can we somehow socially engineer in the sense of assuming that we have less of those, and assuming that some people are still going to seclude themselves, can we do something about that? So keep out some of the bad experiences that we actually want people to stop learning from them, etc. So just assuming that technology is here to stay, how can we move learning from what you taught us?
I'm always okay with taping talks, and I always get very conscious of being taped when the discussion part starts. The first one on the durable encounters and the fluid encounters. Yes, and you're right that there is there's an element of when people see the same people over again, and this is one of the arguments in the Community as Urban Practice book, is that is a concept of public familiarity, which came originally from Lynn Loveland and Cloud Fisher, that there is it's not the public stranger, but it's this idea that there is a public familiar stranger, but it's an idea that there's an atmosphere of familiarity because you've seen certain things happen all the time. So you know these are the drug dealers, and you have no trouble passing by them. You're not afraid because you know that they're there and they know you're there, and there's this mutual recognition. So yes, on the neighborhood level that works. I'm struggling with the identifiability and all that kind of notions from social psychology and the contact hypothesis and all these things on a more, this is why I said I want to move out of neighborhoods, because I'm struggling with how that works in city center, S-Bahn, Unter den Linden, places like that. So I'm the Latin American kind of Bogota, Sao Paulo scholars with whom I've talked about these kind of things always say, well, you're romanticizing, or not you're romanticizing, but this idea of a vivid public space, we're completely beyond that because it's so dangerous and so violent, we don't go out that way. But that also I think, relates to your question that yes, I see that point, that it's much more convenient and much more secure and much more protected to never be in a situation where something like that may possibly happen. Negative experiences. And I think that is something that I greatly struggle with what that means, because it cannot mean that we leave public space to brutalization. And the problem with that argument is that it very quickly becomes a class-based argument, as if the middle classes are such perfect people that only if they would be using public spaces with their behavior, their normal behavior, their proper behavior, public space wouldn't be as bad. So it's tricky to see how to resolve the yes, maybe it's better not to have that terrible experiences, but maybe it's best that they don't happen. And I don't think by those who can take the luxury to be achtsam in their own circles and stay in their own bubbles, that luxury to do that is going to make those things not happen. So if you have racist attacks or homophobic attacks in Berlin, these are not going to go away by some people doing everything digital. So therefore, I think it's a moral argument, and I'm a sociologist and not a philosopher, so I can't make any moral arguments. So I won't. The two questions about the future direction, about the mechanism. My favorite story in answer to that question is when people decide to what kindergarten they send their kids, none of that says, we don't want to go with the Turks. And yet we end up with highly segregated kindergarten in Berlin. The reason for that is that vegan food or Montessori pedagogics and all these things is very important. So if you look at the moms, this is what we did. We look at how do you organize resources for your kids. None of that in Kreuzberg is about, oh, I don't want to be with people that are different. No, on the contrary. And yet it is really difficult in everyday life because other arguments are more important or other arguments are central. So abandoning things like Kinderladen, which is a concept where parents can start their own kindergartens, is one step. Everybody, now forbidding private schools is another one. There's various things that you could think of to make that disappear. And none of that is going to happen. So with regard to the algorithm and what is the mechanism in the technological, in that why we're doing those things, I haven't thought that to the end. I know that when I read Technological Bluff in the 1980s by Jacques Ellul, I thought it was fascinating. And I've been going back to that because I think we have the extreme version of Technological Bluff because it's always like, but you can do it in the app. And then I said, well, do I have to do it in the app? And then the restaurant says yes. And then I said, oh, I'm sorry, I want a menu. I don't know how to operate my phone. And I'm gray enough for that to be believed. So just because it's there, we didn't have to do it. And I can't really figure out why we do that stuff, because it really makes no sense. So I have no answer to that. The last one, if I made the German passports and the belonging, I think there's a huge problem with belonging, because the way it's discussed in the literature is often that it's fixed in place. So I've been sort of arguing that belonging is interesting if you think about it, and that was what you said in the beginning about roots and routes. So roots with O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-A-S. So that you can belong through roots, that you can travel and belong, that you can have multiple moments of belonging. I think the literature on belonging tends to go in a direction that treats people like trees, as if you have roots. And if you're uprooted The people that move are uprooted. And I would be interested to see what that means in the context of Israel, I guess. But and so we need, if we're going down the road of making belonging a central concept, I think we need to be very careful that it doesn't become place attachment. Because the moment it's place attachment, it doesn't solve the issue of who has the right to belong on basis of being on the ground and in the ground and rooted. Yeah, so maybe that's enough. I'm talking too much.
No. But maybe one last question because we are out of time. Okay, so thank you very much. The next speakers we have are Limor Yehuda and Michal Breyer. They will present the paper Apartheid City in Jerusalem, Law, Planning and Social Transformation. You will both talk, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So Dr. Limor Yehuda is a researcher at Truman Research Institute for Advancement of Peace and the Van Leer Institute and a lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Previously, Limor clerked for the President Aaron Barak at the Supreme Court of Israel and practiced human rights law at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, where she directed the Department for Human Rights in the occupied territories. Her book, Collective Equality, Democracy and Human Rights in Ethno-National Conflicts, is expected to be published in Cambridge University Press this year. Congratulations. In addition to her academic work, Limor is founding member of A Land for All, Two States, One Homeland. Michal Breyer. Dr. Michal Breyer is an architect and urban planner who specializes in urban political geography. She holds a PhD from the Department of Government and Politics at Ben-Gurion University of Negev. Currently, Michal is a postdoctorate fellow at Harry Truman Research Institute for Advancement of Peace at the Hebrew University. She is a research and teaching fellow at Urban Clinic, where she is head of planning. Michal's research focuses on nexus of planning, urban informality, and citizenship, on questions of land, housing, and development policy, on the conceptualization and production of urban knowledge, and on spatial justice and equality. Her research has been published in Environmental and Planning A, Planning Theory and Practice, and the Annals of American Association of Geographers. Michal serves as a chairperson of the human rights organization BIMCOM, Planners for Planning Rights. And also Michal is going to be next year Minerva's research postdoctorate fellow, right? Next year, yes. So, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Great to be here. Lovely presentations yesterday. Very diverse, I thought, and surprising. I'm not from the field of cities, okay? So we are doing the two parts. I'm coming from transitional justice, human rights, and stuff like that, and Michal is bringing the urban issues. But I'm living here, so I know the area. Okay, so this is really a work in progress in early stages, and we will be really grateful for any comments and suggestions, or okay, or no, okay. So the presentation, as it says, compares between the apartheid city in South Africa and Jerusalem. While there are significant differences, so it's not something that we invented, it's already out there for a long time, this comparison. So although there are significant differences between the two cases that we'll not go into, we don't have time, there are also significant similarities that makes the comparison useful and we think surprisingly insightful, as it can expand our thinking, not only about criticism, but also about how possible progression can take place. So our argument is basically this, 3 points in a way. The Israeli regime that expands between the river and the sea, okay, we do already many assumptions, aims for Jewish domination in the entire territory. Within this context, which is a context of conflict over domination, the city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, is at the heart of that. The aim to keep united Jerusalem under Jewish domination reflects but also supports the bigger picture of the conflict. And of course, within that, also the conflict is also reflected in the daily lives of the city. Despite overarching policies of legalized domination, significant counter-apartheid policies, processes resembling processes that took place during the apartheid regime in South Africa are taking place. So this is the second step of the argument. And the third step is that these counter-apartheid processes can undermine Jewish supremacy and can support a gradual Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation that is based on the ideas of equality and partnership. So there are a lot of assumptions and wishful thinking for the future, but I think there are some grounds to that, okay? So we will present our arguments in 3 stages, First, we will talk briefly about the comparison of Israel to apartheid South Africa and why it has merits. Second, we compare the ways in which the apartheid city and Jerusalemite apartheid have developed. And finally, we point to the various processes that took place during and under the apartheid regime in South Africa and compare them with processes that are taking place in Jerusalem during the last 2 decades. We find most interesting the fact that these processes, which predated the political transition in South Africa, had a noteworthy contribution to the political transition there by undermining the formal policies of racial segregation and particularly of keeping South Africa's cities white. We suggest that the gradual processes that take place in Jerusalem may also have similar long-term contributions. So first we go to, the other way around. Okay, making the case for comparison. The apartheid policies that were pursued by South African governments between 1948 and 1994 were characterized by official and legal racial segregation, following the ascent to power of the National Party in South Africa. The apartheid policies were justified in terms of minimizing friction between culturally distant population groups and practically served as means of control imposed to maintain relations of domination. Maintaining dominancy depended crucially on control of access to political power, but also included control of access to the means of production and levels of employment, education, training, and opportunity necessary to socioeconomic mobility. Control over land resources, their ownership, use, and distribution, over access to services and amenities, and control over spatial relations through segregation and urban containment. The racial groups included the African majority, the political dominant white minority, and colored or mixed race minority, and the smaller Asian or Indian minority. So the 3 spatial scales of apartheid, there are 3. So the first is the micro-level segregation. So how apartheid, how harmony in the multiracial South Africa had been pursued, harmony through separation, which apartheid sought to achieve through these 3 scales. Micro-level segregation, what is also called the petty apartheid, involved separate amenities from park benches to buses and post offices, what we usually see when we imagine apartheid, but this is not the main thing. Actually, what is the major thing of apartheid was that, the macro level apartheid, but also the meso scale segregation of the 4 legally defined population groups in separate residential areas of towns and cities, and the macro scale segregation in the forms of reserves, which under apartheid were become independent states known as Bantustans, homelands, and national states. At face value, Israel Okay, no. At state value, the State of Israel does not follow a similar racial segregation. As we saw, we don't have those benches and different entrances to post offices, but also because Palestinian Israelis hold Israeli citizenship with many things that come with that. However, the main confusion, we argue, seems to arise from the preliminary assumption that the Israeli case should be evaluated without its treatment of the Palestinians that reside in the West Bank and Gaza. Here we built on arguments made by others, Shenhav, Iftach Lustig, Kretzmer, human rights reports on this subject. And following them, we also assume that the Israeli regime should be evaluated solely, should not be evaluated solely by its practices within the Green Line and towards its citizens and legal residents, but should be evaluated based on its practices towards the entire population living under Israel's control between the Jordan River and the sea. When we look at the entire territory, so the examination is different, and then we find many similar practices. First of all is the Jewish domination or Jewish supremacy as an official norm based first on the nation-state law of 2018, cementing hierarchical citizenship, and second, and more recently, in the founding agreements of the current Israeli government, which state that the Jewish people have the sole and unassailable right to all parts of the land of Israel. Secondly, relations of domination are imposed by controlling the access to political power through exclusionary citizenship regime, control of land resources, segregation in residential areas achieved in various ways. In the West Bank, those are official, but in other parts of Israel are not. Movement restrictions and access to services and amenities, including water, electricity, and health. So now I pass on to Michal.
So one of the things that is one of the main characters of the Israeli regime is actually the hierarchy of citizenship. And I think, we're seeing everybody shouting out democracy these days, but I think it actually highlights that the citizenship is actually not universal and not and is not equal. And so for the sake, and again, this has been discussed in the literature, and I'm not going to rehearse all of that, but for the sake of our argument, we separate it into three main groups. So the first group is the full citizenship, and of course that has many different grades within it, between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel, but they're all within the category of full citizenship, at least legal citizenship. And then we have the non-citizens, okay, the last category, which is non-citizens, non-residents that have no rights within the Israeli regime. And Palestinian Jerusalemites are actually some sort of gray category within that, because they do have residency rights in the city, permanent residency, but they're not citizens of the state. Now, what does that exactly mean? It means that they have a relative freedom of movement, they have some social benefits, but the status of residency needs constant ratification. It can be revoked, and it is being revoked sometimes. And of course, it does not imply an equality of rights. Okay? And so with this, we move to the city itself. And how actually, and we wanted to look at how racial segregation was constructed on the city level in South Africa, and then look at Jerusalem and see if we can make some comparison. So, separation between racial groups did not begin with the apartheid regime in 1948. It actually began before that, and the cities were actually segregated from the colonial heritage. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. Yeah. So we have a colonial heritage of, of segregating between whites and natives, and we see that in many different countries. But part of what brought actually apartheid was the feeling that cities were becoming less segregated, and the coming in of many Africans into the cities was actually part of what pushed for formalization of apartheid, of the apartheid policies. And so on the city level, wait, where am I? Okay. So we have, and again, we have these two levels. We have the macro level, and we have the meso level. And so on the meso level, which is the city level, the main legal act was the Group Areas Act, which formed a kind of a cornerstone of apartheid. It created a legal framework for particular neighborhoods to be for certain group areas, so designated for one group, one particular race, and this race could own property in the neighborhood and reside in the neighborhood. And of course, the result was the displacement of hundreds and thousands of people, okay, and mainly Indians, colored, and Africans. Whites were almost never displaced, or I think 99% of the whites stayed where they were. So moving all these people out of the city was very tightly connected to the macro level, which is the city is not a place for Africans or for colored people, but the Bantustan's or the nation states, so they have other places to go. So these two levels are actually very closely connected to each other, need each other in order for the system to work. And you have the map there for anyone who wants to look at it. I'm not going to explain it. Okay, so what is happening in Jerusalem? And I'm going to go a little bit back, but I'm going to run. So, Ottoman Jerusalem, at least from what we know today, was probably quite a cosmopolitan city with no real segregation or segmentation between groups. But we start seeing this segmentation with the British Mandate, and of course the growing tensions between Jews and Arabs are bringing about more and more segregation. And then, of course, we have between 48 and 67, where we have, full separation between the two ethno-national communities. We see two cities with two governments completely separated with an international border between them. And of course, this also populations were moved in that act, okay? And of course, much more Palestinians were moved than Jewish populations, but it happened on both sides of the border. And then we get to 67. And for anyone who doesn't know, three weeks after the war, Israel decided to annex the east side of Jerusalem, and calling it, unification. Palestinians, of course, regarded as occupation. And the main principle was the maximum land and the minimum population for setting the boundary. And of course, and all the policies following that were aimed at maintaining this demographic balance, okay? And I'm saying demographic balance because it's actually maintaining a certain ratio between Palestinian and Jews within the city. It used to be 25%. In 67, it was about 25% Palestinians and 75% Jews. Today, we're at about 40 and 60. So, it really didn't work. And then, of course, we all know, the story of the massive land expropriations and the development of Jewish neighborhoods, which were really seen as these purified Jewish spaces, and with that restricting very strongly any Palestinian development within the city. But it was all these policies were actually not, they're not based on some kind of legal act, like the Group Area Act in South Africa. So it's a different kind of mechanism. And then, okay, and we see throughout, the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, there is some form of, I called it self-government, Palestinian self-government, and of course any term I use here would be problematic. But Israel did not actually have a very strong grip on East Jerusalem and on managing the population and on domination. And of course in the background there's always this thought of maybe this is going to be something else, and it's not really clear. And also this status of residency was made exactly out of the same reasons, right? We're not really sure what's going to happen with these people and with this territory. And the big change we see is during the Oslo process, and starting from the mid-1990s and into the second Intifada, and then the complete breakdown of the peace talks, we see a change of direction. So we actually see, and what, again, in the earlier period, the borders were relatively open, so you could move, from Jerusalem to the West Bank and back. People actually lived in the suburb. Palestinians, Jerusalemites lived in the suburbs. They didn't have to live within the border of Jerusalem. And it was a city with a metropolitan area, with a hinterland, Palestinian hinterland. And of course, a center, political center and so on, an economic center. And what we see from the 90s on is the tightening of the borders. So we see that the legal borders, Israel is beginning to close the legal borders, to restrict people, to make policies that people actually have to live within the city to keep the residency status. And this is causing, and of course the idea, the Israeli idea is to keep as many Palestinians out of the city, but the result is actually exactly the opposite, right? Many Jerusalemites are coming back into the city. And we see this wall being built until, being emphasized until in the beginning of the 2000s, we're building the physical wall, right? So there is the physical wall and the legal wall are working together to harden the separation and to make the city a white city, right? And to keep the Palestinians away. But then there is always this presence of the gray citizens, of the Jerusalemite Palestinians. And in this sense, we do see the separation wall as a tipping point between what we might call as colonial sort of policies to what we call apartheid or semi-apartheid policies. Okay, so we talked about all of that. Okay. So, should I keep going? Okay. And as I said, the meso-level apartheid is not really based on a legal act, but it is based on housing development and on infrastructure policies that are very explicit. So the idea of keeping this, what I said as a demographic balance, is out there. It's in the policy papers. It's explicit. It's not implicit. And the Jewish neighborhoods, we keep Israel keeps developing Jewish neighborhoods, and at the same time underdeveloping the Palestinian neighborhoods and restricting, and infrastructure development is highly segregated and with very large gaps. And many of these policies are actually sitting on the land regime. And I'm not going to get into this because this is really a very, very complicated issue. But the land regime is probably one of the areas where we see legal differentiation between what Jews can do and what Arabs can do, and this has to do with expropriation and with public needs and with unregistered land and absentee properties and a large different policies and different laws that are actually cementing the separation and the differentiation and discrimination between Jews and Arabs. So, counter-apartheid. So if we go back to South Africa for a few more moments, what we see is actually that the permanent black presence remains within the cities. So the idea of creating the purified, the white city doesn't really work. It doesn't really work in South Africa either. And we see more and more gray areas, which are an outcome of a few of different conditions. First is the economic condition. So there's a surplus of accommodation for white people, which are moving out to the suburbs, and then there's lots of space within the city, which is designated as white areas, but it's actually empty. And at the same time, we see a really big shortage of housing for black people, and also the expansion of the middle class, black middle class, and people are starting to sell property to white people are acting as nominees for black people to actually to bypass the segregation law. And then there's liberal cities that are actually supporting these policies, and then there's judicial decisions that are again demising this idea of racial zoning, and of course there's international pressure on South Africa, and all these things together are part of what's demising the segregation. But all of this happens before the official change of regime. Okay, so in 1991. There's a final repeal of the Group Area Acts, but all these processes are actually leading to it. They're not post-apartheid, they're pre-apartheid, which is the most important point for us. Okay, so what's happening in Jerusalem?
I'll conclude in 2 minutes. Okay, so we get to a counter-apartheid processes in Jerusalem. So as Michal said, this is the main thing, looking at the processes that took place under the time of apartheid. When we think there is no hope, the seeds are there, and if we think of our situation resembling that, so the seeds are taking place here and now, and this is where we want to see and think whether we can shift our perspectives on things that are happening on the ground already. So while we do not have the advantage of hindsight with regard to our case, we can point to several processes that can be regarded as counter-apartheid policies in Jerusalem, including Israeli citizenship. So this is not updated. I know that there is a thesis that had been done, and I think it's which is more updated, but we know that there is a progression with East Jerusalemites that are asking more and more for Israeli citizenship. This is one thing.
Also receiving. And
receiving also. Change in residency status. So in the 80s, there was a famous case, Awad case, that actually equaled the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem to immigrants, to the status of immigrants. And actually a few years ago, in 2017, a new decision has been made and actually recognizing that Israeli residents of Jerusalem are different and that it's not so easy to repel their status. This is one, so different change in residency status, change in subsidy housing projects, at least legally. The Jerusalemites are entitled to go for subsidies projects now, or again, following a court decision, moving to Jewish neighborhoods. So although those are still small numbers. We think that those differences, those changes are making a difference. Labor market is shifting, and different mix is happening. Public education, we know the rise of Israeli schools in Israel, curriculum schools, yeah, and of course we will talk about the problematic of that, or the dual element, and formation of other gray areas. Those are many of those are foundings of other of Shlomo and of Stern. Marek Stern. Yeah. So to conclude, the physical wall and the accompanying legal regime had devastating effects on Palestinians living on both sides and fundamentally changed the status and perception of East Jerusalem. From the Israeli standpoint, a notable shift occurred towards establishing a stronger governmental grip, aiming to manage and control Palestinian territory and life in ways that have not been previously exercised. This stronger grip includes both sticks and carrots. Within Palestinian society, in the city, there is a widespread debate about the meaning of partaking in these Israeli initiatives, while some regard these as attempts to normalize Israeli occupation and should be therefore rejected. The others see them as providing long neglected basic rights that can and should be taken advantage of without compromising national demands. What we notice is that in similar veins with apartheid South Africa, these processes have also unexpected results, opening new spaces of shared presence or gray areas. All these undermine, at least to some extent, the logic of ethno-national segregation and Jewish domination, and make way for new living patterns to emerge, and potentially also for new politics that is not rooted in domination and exclusion. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
Convinced?
Okay, thank you very much, Limor and Michal. When I was reading your abstract, I had a question, but now it is even more. More of a question of the similarities between the processes, and actually it also connects to what to Talia's talk. Do you think, first of all, if there is any evidence that in South Africa, before this whole regime collapsed, some more connections, social connections took place, like people were more willing to spend time in in the same areas, or to go to the same schools. It is funny to talk about it now in Jerusalem, but I do notice that Arabs and Jews are sometimes spending time where I wouldn't expect them to do so. Although we might think that it only radicalizes all the time, but actually, for example, my daughter has 4 Arab children in her class. And all the other classes in her school have Arab children as well. So, but of course, it's not statistics. I just wanted to ask you if there were this process in South Africa, if they take place in Israel, and if you think these things are connected to the legal processes you were talking about. Okay, so now let's take some questions. Avner, please.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. Oh, sorry. Thanks a lot. I want to say first that you're very brave to raise this issue. I mean, not academically brave, but politically brave. And I say this as a compliment. I think this is great. And it's about time that we discuss this. I want to suggest that while you were, the beginning of your talk was about one aspect of apartheid, and the end, what you called counter-apartheid, I thought was very different. So, and the difference is that the beginning was institutions, and the second part was behavior. And institutions apply for or include legal matters and policies. So how governments or the local governments act. And there the story was that there's growing apartheid in Jerusalem, I thought. But the what you called counter-apartheid was behavior. And there the story was that there's declining apartheid. So the number of requests or applications for behavior rose, right? So the institution, nevertheless, was not very happy to receive these applications, but or didn't behave accordingly, right? The graph doesn't.
No, it's going up also in the approvals.
That's not what you showed.
The other one.
Okay.
Overall, it does.
Okay, but I mean, what happens is that people behave differently, and I'll give you more. So I thought maybe you should frame the story differently. So institutional apartheid versus citizens' behavior or citizens' behavior, and it could be like a juicy story and or a theory, a very interesting theory. And here are just a few other places where you should go, I think, in order to find different behavior. So my daughter volunteers at the open house, the Gays Lesbians Club, and she tells me that they have dozens and dozens of Arabs who come secretly and then seek for help because they find their communities very conservative. You should come to Hapoel Jerusalem Football Club games. They announce everything in Hebrew and Arabic as well, and they don't have many fans who are Arabs, but they have quite a number. Yad B'Yad Secondary School, of course, that's the only bilingual high school in Israel. Is in the only bilingual high school. There are quite a few. Yeah, but high school, that's the only one, is in Jerusalem, and amazing things happen there. I happened to talk there last week about democracy with the teachers. It was very interesting how the Arab teachers and the Jewish teachers talk about democracy in Israel. And there are quite more and more, I guess there are more examples where you could go and find out, but I'm talking too much. Thank you.
I have another criteria that I wanted to add, which relates to the works of the two of you, which is the entrance of professionals and lawyers and planners in particular who can change the system.
Okay. Yes, you should start answering.
Thank you, first of all. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask about processes of Jewish settlers sort of trying to Judaize or make more Jewish Palestinian neighborhoods. For example, Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, where settler organizations are really trying to push away Palestinians from the neighborhood. And I wanted to ask how this sort of how does that sit inside the theory of de-apartheid? Thank you.
We will, so just answer this question and then we will take some more, otherwise it will be too many. Yeah.
Okay, so I think one of the things we didn't say but came up here in various comments. I think we, or at least I, look at the city or the urban space in a little bit a different way, and the idea of urban citizenship a little bit differently from what we had yesterday in the different discussions, because I think what we see here is actually processes that are happening on the urban level that are challenging the institutional forces. And in this way, the city is sort of a breeding ground for, for reactions and maybe for resistance, maybe for counter reactions, and so forth. And I really like the distinctions you made between the institutional and the behavior. And of course, we have to remember that the integration that is happening is also a product of Israeli institutional work that is working, you know, to have more Palestinian children learning the Israeli Bagrut, to have more Palestinian students within the university, and so on and so forth. So this is a formal policy of Israel, and there is the Tochnit Chomesh, the economic development, and so on. And of course, the main idea of that policy is that, you know, we're doing economic integration, but there is nothing to talk about, you know, national identity, national aspirations. So if you want to integrate, you have to put aside your... but what we see that Palestinians are actually doing is they're saying, yes, we will use all these benefits, but no, we're not going to give up our national identity and our national inspiration. I think this is what makes it really interesting. So to answer just that, and then I'll give to Limor. And of course, the settlers are, in many senses, are part of the institutional, the Israeli institutional framework, and are taking it, you know, pushing it to the extreme more and more. And of course, that's part of the apartheid process, is not the counter-apartheid. So, but again, there's always unexpected results.
Okay, so with regard to the comparison and what we're saying, so in a way, the comparison is metaphorical, or to get an insight from there. It's not the same things that are happening. The different forces and the different what's happening on the ground are very different. So I don't know of any mixing in schools, but we do know of mixing in neighborhoods and many other areas that were unexpected. And actually, and Avner, your distinction is there actually from the beginning of the apartheid. The apartheid is really cementing the segregation in laws and in institutions. This is exactly the time when things that are just there, כאילו מובן מאליו, goes without saying, or suddenly are not goes without saying, and then you need to cement them in constitutions and in laws that you cannot override. So in a way, the contentions is bringing a very clear institutions, and then what I think we see is that the institutions are not able actually to control everything, but in a way it's more complex dance. So and also with regard to your question, so it's not only that we see only apartheid or only counter-apartheid, we see both. And the question, of course, which of the forces will be stronger? And this is why I think it's important to look at the various forces and see how do we look at them, what is our, whether we enforce the forces that we see as positive, our thinking, what is positive and what is negative. I think this is the main thing that we should be looking at, and this relates to Jews in Palestinian neighborhoods, right? So if we come from non-apartheid thinking, so there is nothing wrong with Jews living in Palestinian neighborhoods, right? The problem is not about the mixing. The problem is about domination and the need or the wanting of expropriation in unjust manners, in a way. So I think it's, again, shifting our minds of the processes that are taking place and maybe opening conversations that had not been done before. That's
okay, Shai.
Thank you. I have nothing against the use of the term apartheid, and I think that it has been very helpful politically and internationally to galvanize the opposition to the atrocities that are taking place. But I'm kind of more wondering about it theoretically, how helpful it really is, and what do you think it does instead of using domination, segregation, separation, assimilation, or various other terms, because it seems as if it kind of obfuscates more than it clarifies, at least as analytical terms. So, you know, for example, the decision slash choice slash, I don't know how to call it, of Palestinians not to use their voting rights, right? I mean, how does the term, because, right, I mean, they have the right to vote in the municipal elections. Pardon?
On the municipal level.
On the municipal level, and the Palestinians constantly decide not to do that. Yeah, I mean, 2% do, but that would make a huge impact, for better, for worse. And apartheid somehow, I don't know exactly what it does to this kind of more complicated story, but my sense, again, that as a political maneuver at the international level, it has been very important. I'm wondering what it does theoretically. Is it actually hiding more than it helps discover?
Like 2 more questions very quickly, and then some quick answers, because we are almost out of time.
I'm continuing at Shai's point exactly. In the postdoc research proposal, I did a postdoc but didn't pursue the research. So the proposal was about the transitional justice city. And I think, and the framing for me, I mean, it's basically more or less the same research that I didn't do, so thank you. No, but I think the framing makes the whole difference of also how you look at it. I mean, when it's the apartheid city, of course, we are we are highlighting the obstacles, and when it's, I mean, for me it was the transitional justice city, but whatever you would call it, then we really highlight the gray zones, or the thing, or the counter apartheid acts. And so just to say, I also think that this doesn't serve your cause very well, in a sense. And maybe that's also like a shift you can do analytically or theoretically within your research, even within the same paper, of showing how and for me this is what the city allows, because of course if we go to the West Bank, it's apartheid. I mean, we don't need, but it's not. But in the city, it's not an apartheid city. It's actually where. Okay, I mean, we can discuss, but this is where apartheid maybe breaks and doesn't work as well as they would like it to. So also.
So I'm gonna continue some of the themes here, but just a personal note. My grandfather was in a kind of armed group against apartheid in South Africa, and he had to leave to not get imprisoned. Then he moved to the UK. And ended up here, and unfortunately he died a year before I was born. And I always wanted to ask him, didn't you notice certain similarities? Why didn't you start a resistance movement here? Not violent, of course, because we recorded. No, because I'm against violence. Anyway, so I feel this personal interest in this question, but I wanted to maybe bring, I think the institutional versus kind of grassroots is important, but what you said about the relationship between them is especially important, not to stick to these divisions. But I was wondering, kind of continuing this debate of whether the apartheid helps here from 2 fronts. So I want to add the temporal dimension, that we're talking about different time periods. So perhaps rather than saying they are similar, would it be more helpful to ask, what does apartheid mean today? For instance, through the digitalization of space, certain new ideas. Maybe that's something worth asking. And then continuing on the temporal aspect, I do still wonder whether the framework of colonialism doesn't help us more when we're talking about from the river to the sea, because I think there's a lot of interesting literature about how colonialism is not just about dominating space, it's also about dominating time, the past and the future. So if Palestinians are integrated into schools but are not learning about their history, it's still a form of, for me it continues certain colonial aspects of domination. Or if we're talking about gray areas, I'm not sure if you're referring to Iftach El's theory, but these are spaces where people do have citizenship, but they are displaced from their homes, as was mentioned earlier, or they live in the fear of being futurely displaced from their home. So, sorry.
3 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so to Ishai's main and following that. So my whole work is basically on those kinds of questions, and until now I didn't use the apartheid comparison for many reasons, why I don't think it's really
fits within our framework. And I used ethno-national. My book is about ethno-national and about domination and all this stuff. And usually I think this is a good comparison, and I work with them. I thought that for this project specifically, there is something to the apartheid analogy, not because this is completely the same, because it highlights what we wanted to say, that even in the darkest times, even when we see that there is no hope, there are processes that are going on. Even when we have, what we can see in Israel today is the hardening of the legalization of the separation. This is the difference. We want to point to that there is this hardening of legalization of the segregation. And I think this is why in 2014, I decided, when we did the report about the West Bank and the two legal systems, we didn't use apartheid because I didn't think it was necessary to make the point. But I think here, in this context, I think it's useful. That's why, because it have the insights of, even when we are looking at legalized apartheid, there are processes that are taking place. And as Michal said, both of those processes are institutionalized in a way, but also supports behaviors that are deeper and rooted. And maybe, so I think it helps in this case, not everything everywhere all the time. And about apartheid, of course, apartheid is both a historical phenomena and a legal concept. Here we looked specifically into the historical phenomena, again, because of this specific insight that we wanted to take.
Okay. So, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker and the last for this session, Ishai, Merav. Okay, our last speaker is Noga Kedar, who is an urban sociologist studying cities, ideas, and the dialectic relations between them. In her research, she examines what it means for a messy and complex entity like a city to adopt a new idea, and how particular policy models have become must-haves for cities. She is currently a postdoc in joint research of the University of Toronto and Hebrew University, and acts at the head of the research of the Urban Clinic at the Hebrew University. Noga will talk about something that could be actually relevant for more than only this panel, about evolving epistemologies of placemaking tools for theoretical and diagnostic analysis.
Okay. So the title of the lecture is The Mobility of Placemaking, a Layered Approach. Placemaking is a fuzzy term. It's a concept, it's a methodology, a planning tool, which is used to shape and reshape public spaces, and often with space users. And it became a very central buzzword in the planning world in recent years. If you Google it in Hebrew, you'd find these various images of colorful gathering places, benches, stairs, libraries, and also several guides of how you should do placemaking. The origin of this concept, as Tarek said yesterday, is in the 60s and the 70s within Europe and the US. And we'll speak about it in more details in a few minutes, but as you can see in recent years, it became a social movement of professionals that practice this method all over the world. And just from this map, you can see where placemaking weeks are held. Placemaking weeks are opportunities for placemakers to share their knowledge in workshops and to train one another. And of course, in addition to that, there are regional networks and various platforms that spread these type of ideas. And placemaking is also the object of the joint research project that Katya just told you about. And at the center of it, we are asking how such concept travels and in different contexts. And just to give a glimpse of what we do, here is, for instance, a map based on Google searches of placemaking, and what we are trying to do is to show how different meanings stick to it. So, for instance, placemaking in the US is very, very much connected to creativity, in the UK to planning, in Brazil to gentrification, and it changed as a result of different external shocks like the pandemic or the economic recession, and we are examining this type of evolution. Today I'm going to present a research that Emily Silverman and I are doing, which aim to describe the evolution of the term by reading the text of the key thinkers and the organizations that are actually circulating and preaching for this practice, and also by analyzing key examples that became kind of flagship models that the social movement is trying to promote over the world. And there's an inflation of the use of the term placemaking. I think that for a variety of just the lectures from today and from yesterday, actually, we could call different things placemaking. And in the academic literature, you see reference to placemaking when we speak about activism at the community level, the neighborhood is placemaking, ethnic enclaves are placemaking, pretty much everything. And what we are trying to do here is to focus on things that are called placemaking by people who identify themselves as placemakers, for instance, Tarek, who we met yesterday, but also because this may restrict the sample to more kind of mainstream approach. We're also looking at other type of interventions that maybe the people themselves who are doing that do not recognize it as placemaking. For instance, encampment of homeless people. They not necessarily identify this action as placemaking, but that maybe scholars or advocates that are part of the movement want to learn something from that in order to expand the toolbox of placemaking. So this is something about our sample. And in order
so your sample also examines such things where placemaking isn't mentioned as a term?
No, when the people that practicing placemaking, for instance, when homeless people don't relate to the encampment as placemaking, but a placemaker is want to learn something from that in order to adapt it to the movement. So this is also included, and you'll see some examples here. And in order to describe the evolution of placemaking, we use this analytical tool, which we call the spatial triangle. It's a heuristic that synthesizes three main elements in the literature about policy mobility and the way that ideas move and circulate and get new meanings. And it's actually an integration of three units of analysis. First of all, ideas about how to implement an urban change, and here the literature speaks about a variety of things. It can be a funding mechanism, or it can be a very big theory like smart cities or creative cities. And the second unit is the places where they are implemented and the type of forces and local context that shape them. And the third unit of analysis is the actors that connect between places and ideas. And on the one hand, this level is an analytical tool or theoretical tool to assess the local translation and the kind of broader epistemologies that are developing around it. But also it's a diagnostic tool for practitioners to assess and how a certain project was adapted. And this is the triangle that you can see on the right. And I want to add that Emily Silverman, who's the head of the Urban Clinic, who's working on this with me, is a prominent figure in this placemaking movement. She's the person who brought the term to Israel. You can see a poster from a placemaking week in Israel. And the clinic, as an institution, did a lot in order to promote and develop the tool. And she's pretty much interested in the diagnostic element of that and how to, in a sense, to make the tool of placemaking better. And for me, I'm less curious about that. I'm more interested in how ideas are mobilized, and in a kind of a critical stand as well on this movement. And the question of the conference of who owns the city is pretty much at the essence of the inquiry of what we are doing. And through the talk, you'll hear different interpretation of the concept of placemaking, and each one of them embed a different notion of who owns the city. And I'll try to collect this different interpretation through the talk. So first of all, I'll summarize very briefly main takeaways from the policy mobility literature about each of these sides, and we use them mainly to distill main questions that could guide an analysis of how a translation of placemaking operates. So first of all, about ideas. The movement of ideas is often called in the literature fast policy, which speaks about the way that this type of ideas like placemaking circulates, and also to the hegemonic nature that they have if they circulate so widely, and to the shallowness of this type of concept if they can adapt it everywhere or to be adopted everywhere. And placemaking is often identified as a fast and shallow policy, and also because its own self-promotion, one of the main slogans of placemaking and the institution that promote it, which is called the Project for Public Space, is do it quicker, lighter, and cheaper, which means that it can be a very easy thing to be implemented and to circulate fast. And in recent years, the fact that it became such a buzzword also speaks about that it's not necessarily a deep idea that contains a deep change in place. But the talk will try to show you otherwise, that while in some cases it might be quite shallow, the fact that there is now a social movement and that it spread so much, it means that it also gathers various meanings, and that they have different type of potentials. So what we are mainly asking is, when we look at ideas, what are the type of core assumptions that are underlining this type of attempts? What are the values and goals that are being promoted, and the method developed in order to do such a practice? For places, what are the locations that are being circulated as main examples? What are their physical and material attributes? And what are the meanings associated with them? Which histories, identity, and experience they are trying to represent? And for actors, we are asking which kind of sectors are involved in producing these spatial objects, and what are the roles and responsibility of each one of them. And often the analysis of the movement of ideas and social movement in general is using a metaphor of wave, like for instance in feminism there's a first wave that was replaced by the second wave, and each generation has its own goals, or within speaking about movement of ideas, the metaphor of paradigms is very strong, assuming that one replaces the other. And we felt that there's a need for a different metaphor in order to describe what happens in a situation in which the same ideas in being implemented in very different contexts and may mean different things, but at the same time it leaves us in kind of a global spheres of gathering. For instance, in conferences, when a person like Tarek meets placemakers from the United States or from Asia, and each one of them is experiencing very different challenges in using the concept. So it's the metaphor of layers, we feel, represent better the ability to pick a certain kind of epistemology that can be replaced by a different one, but all of them are available at the same time. And the importance of identifying them is also in order to create a better conversation among practitioners of what are we actually speaking about when you speak about placemaking. So I'm going to describe you briefly each one of the main layers that we identified, and these are kind of general prototypes of different ways to do placemaking. And I'll use the three unit of analysis of ideas, places, and actors. So the first layer, we called it sociable open places. And in the background, you can see the example of Bryant Park in New York, which is pretty much promoted as, in order to create such a placemaking intervention. So we'll begin with ideas. The origin of these ideas are coming from Western thinkers like William White, Ellen Jacobs, Jane Jacobs, Young Gell, Donald Appleyard, who were criticized urban modern planning and the fact that it kind of lost the sense of place when planning cities. And it happened for various reasons, for the very rigid zoning, for the preference of car over pedestrian experience, but more generally, as a result of the assumption that crowdedness is something that should be dealt with urban sprawl. And the assumption of these thinkers is actually that the fact that a city is dense is one of the main quality of a city that could be used as an asset. And the method that they develop, each one is doing a slightly different thing, but the main approach is to actually look at open spaces, whether these are squares or parks, and understand what makes one a place which is much more sociable and allows meaningful interactions in which people are not passing by to work, but are meeting there with friends and doing a picnic and having a short talk. And the method was actually to observe these type of places and what makes some of them alive and some of them quite dead. And to use this in order to support the place with a suitable infrastructure and suitable programming. And so you can hear that the type of places and the locations are more traditional open spaces. They include parks, offices, and squares adjacent to large public institutions. And the material used to create such interventions are things like movable seatings that allow an interaction to be a better one than a stable bench, thinking about the shade and the sun, about annual planting, about food and the different type of activities that could make an area into a space. And here in the case, for instance, in Bryant Park, the assumption is that such a place, which is a very crowded one at the center of the city, could be some kind of open-air living room for a very big city. And the meaning, Bryant Park was in the 70s was one of its main names was a needle park. It was a scary place with a lot of drug activity and soliciting. And for a city like New York, and here I'm moving to the third component of actor. In order to renovate such a place for a city that just experienced bankruptcy, it wasn't a feasible political or economical task. And there's a kind of a policy innovation at this moment. Until this stage, public spaces were mainly managed by cities. And at this stage, when placemaking first emerged, the idea was that actually public-private partnership could generate this type of places. So one of the main actors in this case specifically is the Rockefeller Foundation. The teamed up with the city in order to renovate it, and one of the requirements was to establish the business improvement district that will manage the space. So this is basically a non-public business that operates such a space based on the fees that are collected from the businesses. And it brings its own standards of hiring, for instance, and its own laws of how to regulate the space. So, for instance, demonstrations are not allowed, drinking alcohol outside of the restaurants, and of course that a lot of it became a very successful case, also because it benefited the stakeholders around homeowners and businesses, but it also became to be kind of a metaphor for a public space that lost its publicity, its ability to be public, its ability to promote democracy, and a place that is very privatized and consumerist. So if I summarize this layer, there's an understanding that the rise of the use value by investing a lot in a space can also come with the rise of the exchange value that can benefit everyone around. And it's of course something that we criticize a lot today, but I think that also think contemporarily at this stage it was also a new possibility to renovate these kind of places and to bring more stakeholders. The second layer, which we term multi-purpose community spaces, and we don't think it's a good title, so I'd be very happy to hear from you about alternatives, to think with us. And the model here, which is pretty much promoted in recent years, is the example of La Marina de Valencia in Valencia, which was in the 90s a dilapidated port surrounded by working class neighborhood. And it went through an entrepreneurial innovation redevelopment that cost a fortune for the city, with all the bad things that we know about this kind of approaches of bringing star architects and mega events and a place for many yachts to moor, but actually the place was empty, almost unused, and left the city with a huge debt. And the placemaking intervention as a result of that its aim was to create a sustainable place that benefit the local community and adds more additional type of values. But to speak more generally about layers, the second layer, as you'll hear in more details, is a response to the first one and an attempt to fix things that didn't work in the first attempt. But it also develops as an alternative to current dynamics of the time. And here it's mainly economic and cultural globalization and a type of method to shape place that they are bringing with them. At this stage, a very prominent way to develop public spaces and spaces in cities more general is place marketing, investing in iconic buildings, convention centers, stadiums, commercial malls, waterfronts that often operates a single-use destination. And first of all, the infrastructure has been built, and only later on the kind of function that can be applied are being thought of. And placemaking offers a slightly different approach. First of all, not thinking of tourists and the creative class and the capital that can come to the city, but first of all to think about the local communities and how to serve them, but also to think about how function is not produced by the physical infrastructure, but it's something that should be incrementally experienced, and by using different kind of experiments in place and to see what works for people. And another very prominent event of the era is also the economic recession in 2008 and the mortgage crisis that transformed placemaking to be a key tool for cities to deal with this type of new challenges, and a method to improve vacant spaces, to produce new goods like healthy food in areas of food deserts, after school programs, and different type of things that the neoliberal cities no longer provide. Whoa, okay. So the main idea here is to add new type of values, which are basically the values that the UN promote in the SDGs. It should promote health, it should promote inclusion, local economic growth, cultural preservation, and more. It's not sufficient for a place to be just a sociable gathering place. And the location, as you can hear, are places like waterfronts or streets or markets that have a different type of a function from the first place. And for instance, market is a place where you buy things. You don't necessarily gather there to meet friends or to do cultural activities. And it changed in our own mind as we experience cities today. And here in Valencia, you can see how they try to use the specific histories and the heritage of the place. For instance, the fact that it's pretty much based on sea activities in order to create something new. So, for instance, conflicts with yacht owners and boat owners didn't allow people just to use the sea anymore, even though it was their sea. Different open public pools were opened and movie nights were happening there. Here you can see people watching Steven Spielberg movie of Jaws while they are in the water. So different kind of elements that allows the recreation, but also to connect to the identity of the place. And for instance, one of the laws was that local restaurant can just buy from local fishermen and not from other places. In order to different examples of how you do things in order to strengthen and contribute back to the communities, and in a way, an attempt to balance between the use value and the exchange value. And the third thing is actors, and here we can see two new type of actors. First of all, the residents themselves. The assumption was, if in the first layer, the assumption was that we should very carefully observe people and what they are doing and to facilitate a place according to that. Now the assumption is that these people have a very deep knowledge about how a place can be successful, so they are included in the process. And a second very important actor is the international networks in which placemakers are exchanging this type of knowledge and learn from one another. And here you can see, for instance, a placemaking week held in Valencia. And it's, of course, a way to promote this type of activities, but it is also a space for reflection of what we are doing, what we can do differently, and how this could be advanced. So to summarize this layer, there's an attempt here to balance a bit between the use value and the fact that it brings with it displacement and this type of consequences, and to try with different ways to benefit the community back. The third layer of placemaking, which we term placemaking and incomplete citizenship, is carried by and for marginalized populations who are limited in making modification to space. And this is still an emerging layer, and the research is mostly a set of disjoint case studies that kind of waiting for a theoretical glue. So there's no one model here. Maybe Sincila, that you heard about yesterday from Tarek, will be such a model promoted within the network. But you can see a very different type of examples. So for instance, here you can see the dense urban village of Indonesia and the cultural festivals that they are doing basically in the slum of the city, or rural low-income housing in Mexico, which are a very different kind of a physical environment than a slum, than an urban slum. And here you can, but it's not just example from the global south. Here you can see a encampment of homeless people in Oakland and the self-building of kitchen and cultural events. So, and I think that the example from Tarek yesterday was very strong to understand that here we are speaking about people that are pretty much restricted in how they can shape spaces. So then, 2 more minutes, Katya. And often the regime does not recognize the right for the land, and many of the things that they are doing are considered to be illegal. And the goal here is to supply basic needs like lightening, just to allow a space of gathering, or a sewage, and to enhance a sense of ownership and belonging in this type of event, even if you cannot own a thing. Tarek said yesterday that I don't care who owns the city. I just care about the use and what we can actually do now. And the places are, in many cases, are not public spaces, not considered public spaces by the municipalities. They can be stairs and rooftops and balconies, and they maybe belong to the compound or to the extended family, and they are definitely not zoned. They can be also zoned for other type of uses that are not public use. And for this reason, they may be considered illegal. And the intervention may challenge the type of stigmas also that these kind of places are carrying with them. So for instance, the rural compounds in Mexico that were associated with disorder, dirt, and illegitimacy, the fact that they create their own placemaking allowed them to become a part of the city from the perspective of the urban dwellers. For actors, like the second layer, the group of actors include this time the place user. They are pretty much at the center of things, and also international organizations that are funding this type of activities. But the main difference here is that residents are considered to be inferior or to have incomplete citizenship, whether it's for economic reason, for political, or for legal reasons. And placemaking is attempting to react to these type of limitations and working a lot on self-organization, and also to remove the stigmas associated with the people themselves as a result of the placemaking process. So to see them, for instance, as lazy or unclean or even as invaders, placemaking attempt to change this type of associations. And we wanted to mention Sarah Kirsch's thesis about placemaking in East Jerusalem, also done now in the Urban Clinic, that I think will help us to promote the knowledge about these type of places. And just to say that I described to you 3 main layers, 3 main prototypes. And of course, they are not the only. There are many combinations in reality. And what we are trying to do is to use this triangle also in order to assess a project and to understand their potential. So you can see an opportunity to see a project and to rank whether it's on ideas, a first layer, a place, a second layer, and actors, and to try to understand what's going on there. And we can see here, for instance, that one of the main the example that I bring is placemaking renovation of markets, which is happening everywhere. Here, for instance, in Lewinsky Market, the attempt to transform a place which became very popular, but as the pedestrian experience is quite awful there. So to make it a place which is is much more sociable. So we can see here that the places are the layer 2 type of places, a market that weren't supposed to be a gathering place, mainly for commerce, and the placemaking attempt is to add things like local economic growth, health, cultural preservation, but this type of project are thinking of it much more limitedly. and using not necessarily consulting with place users and involving them in the process, but it is mainly managed by business owners and the municipality itself. And we think that this type of assessment allow to see what is missing and also to compare different kind of cases in a global situation. So just to say very briefly about how this all connects to the city and who owns the city. So the first layer brought to the center private interests and allowing them to shape public spaces with the advantage of that and the disadvantage. The second layer attempted to to balance and to bring back power to the community, or at least to put it at the center of the attempt. And the third layer says the question is less relevant of who owns the place. The question is how we can use it in a better way that will benefit also the most marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Noga. It was very interesting, this overbridging analysis of all the methodologies, which we also heard in some other contexts. So it's excellent to provide some analytical framework that connects them all. I have just a small question that can connect you to the two previous discussions. You mentioned that there are placemaking strategies aimed at, for example, giving the sense of ownership or a place of encounter or community. So are there maybe any strategies directed specifically at situations of segregation or conflict like we have, or circulation, for cases where there are two or more social groups that do not meet, but we would like them to meet? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, please, Anthony.
Okay. Placemaking comes from public space project from the United States. That is a private foundation. That is the first thing. Then placemakers act as a kind of urban design army of the neoliberal wing of the globalization projects. Okay? And the aim is to take off public administration from the management of the city. That is similar to Rem Koolhaas and other architects propose respect to planning. There are a kind of two ways to approach the city from this neoliberal thinking. And in your presentation, finally, you mixed two the aspects of tactical urbanism. That is another of these kind of neoliberal privatizing modes of thinking. And sorry, but finally you talk about therapies. Then at the end, the last image was a kind of explanation of a kind of therapy for people. Okay. Be free doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Talia?
Yeah, thank you. I think that brings indeed a lot of things together that we've seen. My first part of my question is similar. Like, I'm reminded of Bryant Park and Sharon Zucken's work on Bryant Park, which argues that this is the absolute no-go when it comes to authentic places and, you know, the city. What was it called again? We all forgot. The Naked City. Yeah, and then Domestication by Cappuccino, which is from Roland Atkinson. I'm not sure what side I want to be siding with, but I do wonder what your take on that literature is. And my second question is slightly more conceptual, maybe, and that is, a lot of these places like Bryant Park, you need to have the time. You don't need the resources. Anybody can go there, but you need to have the time. So, and I'm very impacted by colleagues from Colombia, where in Bogota there is this concept of care blocks, and there's all sorts of things we can talk about in the break. But the point is that I've learned when I was there last year about this concept of time poverty, and it came up when we were talking about 3 hours commute to get to work yesterday. And all these things that you showed us require time. And if the majority of the disadvantaged population is increasingly living not just in economic poverty, but in time poverty, then where are they going to go? How is this going to link? And I think the care block idea that is now pushed by the government, by the Ministry of Gender, or Women's, I think it's Women's Affairs, in Bogota is a really good example of thinking in that direction, and we can talk about it more later. But that was what I wanted to ask you.
Okay, just one more question, and then you'll have time to answer. Ishak?
Thanks. So there's this set of questions which I was also constantly concerned about, but the other is I'm in the end not sure whether it's a normative project or whether it's a project that tries to understand more about the complexity, and you kind of shifted, I think maybe it's a little bit the conceptual, not just the time poverty, but so you showed us all these Google Trends, and you said, you know, in some places it's attached perhaps to the homeless, in other places it would be attached more to businesses and I don't know, creative class, etc. And I actually thought that this was the more promising part, where you could see how ideas travel, what happens to them, how they get manipulated, used. And then I didn't hear anything. And in the end, what I heard was just a celebration. Okay, so I have to say that it was a letdown for me, in the sense that not just the critical element that seemed to be a little missing, and I'm sure you're well aware of it, but also kind of the more interesting element of what seemed to be another promise, which was about the translation, movement, shifting of ideas, changing contexts, which might, again, imbue the concept in really radically different meanings and maybe over time. So I'm just wondering whether you have something to say about that. If it's a future thing, I mean, if it's part of that, but you just chose not to talk about that.
Do you want to answer this question, and then we will pick up a couple more? Yes, because...
So first of all, Anthony, thanks for these comments, and I think that it probably voices what others said about the sense that it's a kind of a speaking more to the normative aspects and not bringing the critical enough, the critical lens. And I agree with all that you said, that PPS is a private organization, though it had new type of partnership with the city of New York, even of creating new bylaws of how you plan squares in the city. But it's definitely a new type of experts coming in a private form that are entering the design of public spaces. And the terms of urban design army and the attempt to take the place of the administration of the city is definitely things that critics of this approach are saying, but I think that the attempt was to show that it's a main critique about a certain phase of placemaking, which is very much focused on this type of private and public partnership. And I think that within this sea of critical argument about that, I think it's also important to show the context in which it was created and which kind of new things it allowed to do. And I pretty much identify with with the criticism of Zuking and David Maiden done regarding Bryant Park, but I think that both of them, and I guess that most of us, find that these are places that we really enjoy to spend time in, and that we have a very ambivalent feeling about them. And also they just became a very prominent form in cities. So there's one question of whether we want to advance that more, and another question is just about how people experience them and whether it brings a good experience or not. So to me, the main thing was to show that things don't stop there, but they continue to evolve as a response to new type of challenges, but also in a way, in an attempt to find new solutions or to think about it in a new way. So in a sense, it was also a reflection of how the way that placemakers themselves are thinking about public space and the way to develop it. Tactical urbanism we didn't mention here, but we actually think of it more as related to the second layer than the third layer. And also other type of interventions like creative placemaking, or urban acupuncture. There's a group of terms that share some similarities and differences. And the challenge is also the normative aspect of this project, and Emily is very much preoccupied with how to teach that, how to make public spaces better places, is also to allow better conversation about that and making the different values and the kind of goals that you can achieve more explicit and then also open to dispute. But for me, definitely the questions of the mobilization of ideas is the more interesting one. The Google Trends is a different project. I just wanted to give you a glimpse of that. But also in this project, the main thing is not to say, for me, how places should be redeveloped, but more the different ways to think about it and the context in which they emerge. And maybe the short presentation didn't do a decent job of bringing up the cases and the criticism. And just for the temporal aspect, which is very interesting, and I want to hear more about that. But I think that definitely the third layer of placemaking is very much preoccupied with that, of how, for instance, people that spend a lot of time in buses, I don't remember which lecture was it yesterday, but to think maybe, Avner's yours, about what is the experience of a bus station and how you can make it more to support community values or things that just will benefit the people who are staying there. And I can say about a project that Michal and I are involved with in East Jerusalem, in Aturi, that we identified semi-public spaces in which religious women just spend time together, and the COVID allowed them to be there, rooftops, for instance, or balconies. And with a group of architects and planners, also Palestinians, the attempt was to bring it into the planning system and to try to help the city develop these type of places and support them with, first of all, recognize them, but also to support them with suitable infrastructure. And this is, I think these are very gendered places. That the issue is not how everyone can be there, but how women and older women can feel safe.
We are completely out of time, so I suggest we just take the question and you answer them during the coffee break. Okay? So, Michal, you wanted to ask something?
Yes. Okay, sorry. So I just so yeah, as you were talking, and it kind of links to some of the other questions. So I think this idea of placemaking is so important, and it's important to take in seriously. And I really admire that kind of approach of identifying the different layers and how it shifted. It made me think of how in one of the guided tours I joined, a Palestinian activist, Amuna Asfour, asked us to look at these benches that they placed in the kind of central area of Jaffa. And she said, on the first glance, it looks like, now people can kind of sit here and enjoy the public space, and it's great, and you're seeing people occupying the space. But she pointed our attention to the fact that the bench was divided. There was like a table, so people can put their food, but it's also a way to prevent homeless people from sleeping on the benches. And she also pointed our attention to the fact, where are these benches located? And she said, where I live in Jaffa, there are no benches like that. So it just kind of made me think of taking some of the points that were raised earlier. Is there a fourth layer of not the community versus the private sphere or the planners, but how do you multiply different communities with different needs? But also maybe some kind of analytical idea of also how to measure the success of these place-making models and who they actually serve. To what extent do they become a way, like a bandage on, neoliberal policies that are actually pushing people out of the city? So that was just my thought.
Okay, so I sort of have two remarks. First of all, I think you should be very conscious of the fact that all the placemaking you're talking about are not so much temporal placemaking, meaning that these are places where the placemaking is stayed, or places where the placemaking acts change all the time, but in a specific area, or things that sort of stick. So you're not looking into things that are more experimental, or many times before something became permanent, there was, for example, many of the bike lanes in cities started as a placemaking act. And then they saw, oh, it's nice, so it became a dominant. So now this is a layer you don't have to address, but I think you do need to be very aware that you're not addressing. So, and another thing is that you're looking at success stories. So any placemaking that becomes not temporal pretty much is a successful story. So you're taking out the things that didn't work, or were experimental. Again, fine. Just just be sure that. The other thing, I'm being real short. Sorry. Okay. That I was thinking about that maybe you should contextualize the third issue as localized self-help, because and this should be something that is not only relevant for the poor. It's relevant for people who feel that they need to do something for self-help. For example, in Portland, they have something which is they have days where people paint mandalas on traffic junctions. This is to promote, because there were a lot of accidents. This started, there was a physics professor, and there was a lot of accidents, and he got annoyed, so he started this act so people would just slow down. And you have many acts that have nothing to do with the person's economic or social status. It's just the fact that people think that they can improve their environment, and this is true to the poor and not the poor. And this is relevant. I just want to tell Talia that I think that it's relevant, at least in my experience, for two types of time issues. The first is the basic one, is that many of these self-help promotes try to bring things into the neighborhoods, for example, community gardens and things like that. But the other thing is that many of them try to understand the bureaucracy time, meaning that in, let's say, poor neighborhoods, many times the municipality takes a longer time to get infrastructures. So they try. So the issue of time there is not actually the time the person spends itself, but actually the time that it takes. You see this in the Bronx in the 70s, that they did all these works that because the city just wouldn't come there, so they said, okay, we'll do it ourselves. And so this is. Yeah. So I'm just saying this is another time issue, but it's relevant just as much as the infrastructure of the personal time, and that's it. I'm out. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentations and the discussion. 15 minutes coffee break.